donate to help sponsor the lectures, pay for the electricity, the lights, the printing of the cards and all that becomes, please recommend it. And have to get in touch with us. Our lecture next month will be Monday, February 12th. We hope it doesn't snow. We'll be by Dr. Gibbon, Newman College. Dr. Gibbon is in the forefront of local amphibian research, and his soirees with frogs in the Delaware Valley should present an exemplary discussion of his recent work. This evening, we are experimenting with producing a videotape of tonight's lecture. I thank also, have to make a comment, Dave Williams, one of our members, actually our microscope curator, has been taking photographs of the things at the Institute that we show people that we're proud of, the great things, the kinds of things that showed up in the current issue that, I guess, the Delaware County Magazine, which you can get free, and the real estate agency. I picked up half a dozen extra copies at I-95 rest stop coming in, but it's average Delaware County. In the current winter 1995-96 issue, there's a two-page spread which features some of Dave's pictures, and it's all about the Institute. It's incredibly positive, and I think we've gotten a few folks wandering in as a result. Delaware County real estate offices, chambers of commerce, and anybody else who wants to promote Delaware County, the Institute is big right now in current issues. Dave has agreed, or he's been taking these pictures for 2 years to try to document our own collection, things that are important that need historical documentation. He also has agreed to try to videotape tonight's lecture. We want that talk in May to be videotaped for historical purposes. And tonight, we would also like to videotape. This is the experimental one, but there's a little bit more than our speakers, Dr. John and Marion Hallahan, have, I'm told, been responsible for our January lectures for the past 33 years. Is that correct? 38? I'm sorry.
In 93, we were here doing this in the Southern Hemisphere. That's why we
with one exception, the year you were in Antarctica.
Yeah.
Well, that's my next question. We really this evening would like to share the Hallahan talk with their longtime friend and our President Emeritus, Dr. Wood Gibson, and the video attempt to give us 2 chances to do the same thing. We really would like to be here. Variant Scientific Organization Council, we greatly appreciate it in terms of expertise with our cataloging project. We thank you. Dr. Hallahan is, of course, as well as a fellow of the American College of Physicians, a fellow Delaware County Institute of Science pioneers.
Can you all hear me? Great. Well, we're really happy that we finally got together tonight after 2 postponements of our program. And we appreciate your patience and your perseverance and time. It seems that you may remember that 2 years ago when we did the program on South Trail, also in the Antarctic area, that we had our program home twice then. So it seems as though every time we go to the whole areas, the local weather wants to create a proper atmosphere for us. So tonight we're going to tell you about the final part of our journey to the southernmost part of the southern hemisphere during December and January of 1992-93. And we're going to the frozen continent of Antarctica. I'm going to move this back. Antarctica is our 5th largest continent, and it is completely surrounded by water, now known as the Southern Ocean, formed by the confluence of the Atlantic, the Indian, and the Pacific Ocean. Its shape is composed of a large circular mass, which is indented by 2 major seas, the Weddell Sea and the Ross Sea. Its western edge is formed by the Trans-Antarctic Mountains along here, which separated from a finger-like projection of the Antarctic Peninsula. We, like the tourists, visited only the peninsula and some of its associated source you use. However, it is pretty much accepted that about 98% of the continent is covered by ice. The depth of this layer of ice varies, and that gives it the highest average altitude of any continent. Its average altitude is 7,500 feet. In contrast, the United States, which is 2,362 feet. This ice cap comprises about 90% of the total world ice, and at least 60% of the world's fresh water. In the deep valleys along the coast, the ice is in the form of glaciers, and there are two large floating ice shelves, the Rum and the Rock, which empty into the Liddell Sea and the Ross Sea. During the summer, many icebergs are shed along the coastline, and they drift northward. And the early sailors learned to make use of the fresh water contained in these icebergs. And today, most of the scientific stations on Antarctica make use of the ice for their fresh water. In order to be a continent, there must be underlying base rock. Otherwise, there would just be a sea, a frozen sea, floating over the area as there is at the North Pole. The average elevation of the rock base is about sea level, but it varies greatly. In the east, in this part, there are places that are 3,000 feet below sea level, but the ice on top raises the elevation to almost 14,000 feet. In the west, there is a rocky massif that rises to the highest in the continent, almost 17,000 feet. Geologically, the large circular part of the continent is quite ancient, and is considered to have underlying ancient granite and old sedimentary rocks on the surface. The peninsula is a more recent material and is primarily volcanic and recent sedimentary rocks. It is in this sedimentary layer that fossils of the giant penguin have been found. This bird was around 5 feet tall and weighed 250 pounds, about my height and twice my weight. Sea ice, also called pack ice, is another characteristic of the continent. In the Antarctic summer, there is always some pack ice around the continent. But in March, the sea ice begins to freeze, and by October, there is a solid mass of pack ice around the continent, which can extend at times as far as South Georgia here, and more than doubles the area of the continent. In the spring, the sea ice will begin to melt, and the prevailing winds from the continent are towards the coast, so that the pack ice drifts away from the coast, and explorers try to make their way through the remnants of the pack ice so that they can land on the continent itself. However, there is always danger of a ship being trapped in the pack ice, even in the summertime, and this has happened to a number of ships, including the Belgian ship, the Belgica, and Ernest Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, about which you will hear a little later. Because it is so cold, any moisture that would fall would be snow. But also, because it is so cold, the moisture carrying capacity of the air is reduced, so that, especially in the interior, there is not very much annual snowfall. The most important factors affecting the weather are wind and temperature. These can plague explorers even today. In the interior, there are generated terrible driving winds called katabatic winds, which means downflowing. They originate in the center of the continent and flow towards the coast. They create terrific blizzards with winds that may be up to 200 miles an hour. What they do is merely rearrange the snow that's already there, much as sand is rearranged in a desert storm. The temperatures along the coast in the winter are not extraordinarily severe, but in the interior they range from generally minus 40 to minus 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And the lowest temperature as their interesting summer visitors. And just to refresh your mind about latitude and longitude, because that was very expensive, that was very important to our early navigators and explorers on the continent, and still is. Latitude starts at 0 degrees of the equator and increases until it reaches the South Pole, where it is 90 degrees south. And that was the goal of the men who tried to reach the South Pole. The longitude starts at the South Pole and 0 degrees goes northward through Greenwich, England, until it reaches the North Pole. In the opposite direction, 180 degrees goes south until it reaches the North Pole. The longitude on this side is east and this side is west. In other words, 80 degrees going right angles to 0 this way would be 90 degrees east longitude, and going this direction would be 90 degrees west. We called our program Pioneers and Penguins, and Jack will tell you about the penguins. And I'll tell you about pioneers. In the early years of polar exploration, there are many stories of men who endured unbelievable weather, often in tiny sailing ships, many less than 100 feet long. Some were lined with copper, but there are records of ship hulls being lined only with tar-soaked canvas, which was not very well. In early land expeditions, men strove to attain goals under extreme conditions. They had no satellites to transmit their geographic position if they needed help and to guide rescuers to them. Many died tragically and others survived miraculously. Although almost every story is fascinating about men whose names are remembered in many places on the map of Antarctica. And if you look at the map over there from the National Geographic, you will find many, many names on the places. And they all represent explorers on there. I have only time to tell you about a few of them. But in order to explore Antarctica, it first had to be found. The early Greeks, Ptolemy, Aristotle, and Pythagoras all believed the earth was spherical. And they also thought that there had to be land to the south to balance out the land to the north. But during the Middle Ages in Europe, for theological reasons, the belief was that the earth was flat. However, the concept of the earth as a sphere persisted in the Arab world and re-entered Spain with the Moorish conquest, and new interest in the unknown lands to the south developed. It was first thought that this land would be attached to Africa, but Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488 and destroyed that. With the discovery of the New World, it was believed to be attached to the tip of South America, and when Magellan went through the Strait and saw Tierra del Fuego, he thought Antarctica was attached to that. However, in 1577, Francis Drake, after he went through the strait, had his ship blown off course, and it was blown off the coast of Cape Horn. And he realized that he was at a point where the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans met. And that place now is known as Drake's Passage between South America and the Antarctic Peninsula. James Cook, certainly the greatest navigator of his time, on his second expedition of 1772 to 75, was commissioned to find this southern land. He got as far as 71 degrees, which would be somewhere in here. But he was prevented from going further south. On his expedition, he actually circumnavigated the whole continent, but he never saw it. He landed on South Georgia, however, and his report of the seals there was responsible for starting the sealing trade. It was not until the next century, in 1820, that there is a record of sighting Antarctica. And today, Russia, Great Britain, and the United States all claim this distinction. Two navigators, the Russian Bellinghausen and the Englishman Bransfeld, record sighting land in their logs, which by location indicate it was the continent, although neither man realized it at the time. America's claim is Nathaniel Palmer, who at the time was a 19-year-old New England sailing vessel. He reported that he sighted land on the peninsula, and today that bears his name. It is Hallahan, it's part of Antarctica, and one of the United States scientific stations there is the Palmer Research Station. The first landing on the continent, we believe, happened the following year, 1821. John Davis, another American sealer, made a landing on the peninsula and reported it in his log, which was lost for many years until it was rediscovered in 1952. He states that he saw a large body of land and went to investigate it for seals. And he said, I think this southern land to be a continent. But it would be another 75 years before a Norwegian would set foot on Antarctic soil again. During the 1800s, many sealers sailed the Southern Ocean, and between 1793 and 1807, 3.5 million seals were harvested. And this harvest persisted until seals were almost extinct. Then the men turned to whales. During the middle 1800s, French, American, and British governments sponsored expeditions, which mainly surveyed the coastline. None of these expeditions landed on the United States expedition was under Lieutenant Charles Wilkes, and he mapped the east coast of the continent, and this land in the east is now known as Wilkes Land. The British navigator James Ross discovered the Ross Sea and the Ross Ice Shelf, and by getting to 78 degrees south, he got as far south as anyone had attained at that time. In 1897, the Belgian expedition, the first truly scientific expedition, took place, and the ship that went was known as the Belgica, and it was the first steam-assisted sailing vessel to go to Antarctica. And one of its crew members was Roald Amundsen, of whom you will hear in a few minutes. This ship was trapped in pack ice, even though it was there in the summertime, and it was forced to winter over the next winter of 1898 in the ice, and it drifted for 3 months from 85 degrees west to 100 degrees west, about here, then here, and it was not set free until the following spring. In 1900, a British party was the first to winter on Antarctica, on the land, and this started land exploration and the push to reach the South Pole. And in this era, 3 names are memorable. 2 are Englishmen, Robert Falcon Scott and Ernest Shackleton, and the Norwegian Roald Amundsen. The first expedition to do overland exploration was led by Robert Scott from 1901 to 1904. He established a base on Ross, tiny bit of land on the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf, separated from the main land of the continent by McMurdo Sound, a little sound coming from the Ross Sea. Ross and his party wintered there, and then the following summer they tried for the pole. They used sledges and dogs, and they set supply depots up to the 79 degrees south when the support team returned to the base. Scott, Shackleton, and another member went on, but they had problems with their dogs that either died or didn't. They were able to get as far south, 80 degrees south, but by that time they were all so sick and exhausted and had to turn back. And Shackleton finally had to be carried by sledge by the 2 other men. And this led to a rift between Shackleton and Scott. On his return to England, Shackleton organized the Nimrod expedition from 1908 to 1909. And 4 men, including Shackleton, crossed the ice shelf, and then a glacier known as the Beardmore Glacier, they traversed the Transantarctic Mountains and reached the polar plateau. They got to 88 degrees, 29 minutes south, only 93 miles from the South Pole. But by that time, they began to experience bad weather, their food supply was dwindling, and they were exhausted, so they turned back, and fortunately, all 4 were able to get back to the base. At the same time, Amundsen was planning a polar expedition. Roald Amundsen was a meticulous planner, and since his time on the Belgica, he had become an experienced Arctic polar explorer. He undertook intensive training for both himself and his crew. He acquired over 50 fine dogs and the best clothing available and the best sled. His original intention was to go to the North Pole, but in 1909, Harry got there first. And so Amundsen secretly changed his plan and decided to go south. And he did not even tell his crew until they were underway that their destination was to be Antarctica. Scott also was planning his second expedition and wanted to be the first to reach the pole. After the difficulties he had with dogs on the first trip, he decided to use motor vehicles and Siberian ponies as well as dogs to help transport supplies. And after Scott was underway, he received orders from Amundsen that Amundsen also was going south. Amundsen arrived in Antarctica in January 1911. He decided to have his base camp on the Ross Ice Shelf, which made him 60 miles closer to the pole. He immediately started to set up supply depots, and then when winter came, wintered over, and finally, in the middle of October, a party of 5 set out for the pole, and they reached the pole in the middle of December. Here he left the Norwegian flag, and because he realized he'd gotten there first, they noted the Scots. Amundsen used dogs to pull his sledges, and even the men themselves at times, and so he and his team did not suffer exhaustion. But they were also fortunate in having reasonably good weather for their expedition. Scott and his party also arrived at their base in Ross Island in January 1911. They wintered over, and then on the 1st of November, he set out to the pole with a large contingent of men, dogs, and motorized vehicles to set up supply depots on the way. Almost immediately, he had problems with the ponies and the vehicles, and soon they both had to be abandoned. When they came to the Beardmore Glacier, where they would cross the mountains, Scott elected to continue with the men hauling the sledges and turn the dogs back. On July 4th, when they had reached the polar plateau, the final supply team turned back, and 4 others started for the pole. Almost immediately, they were beset by bad weather, and even before they reached the pole on January 17th, all men were feeling the effects of the extreme cold, and then only to experience the bitter disappointment of seeing the Norwegian flag and finding Amundsen's letter. They turned back, and blizzard beset them. First, 2 men perished in the party. One had a bad fall and was unable to navigate, and the other suffered from frostbite and died. Then Scott and the remaining 2 men were pinned down in a tent by terrible weather. They died from the cold and starvation because they had run out of both fuel and food, but they were less than 15 miles from their final supply depot. Scott had kept a meticulous diary all through his ordeal, which was found with his body the following spring. The diary was published in England, and ironically, it made Scott more the hero of the South Pole than in 1914, Shackleton organized an expedition to cross the continent from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea by way of the South Pole. He organized 2 parties. Shackleton, with the ship Endurance, would start from the Weddell Sea coast and head to the pole. Meanwhile, another ship would go to the Ross Island base and set up depots from there to the pole. But even though it was summer, in January 1915, Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, was fatally trapped in pack ice, and it drifted helplessly for 1,500 miles to the northwest before it sank. He was trapped in the part of the Weddell Sea, and the ship drifted in ice to this part. Shackleton's men were able to, in addition to food supplies, get 3 small boats from the Endurance before it sank. And when the ice started lifeboats made their way to Elephant Island, a small island at the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. Then Shackleton and 4 other members of his crew navigated successfully to South Georgia and the whaling station there. In other words, they navigated in a small lifeboat from here over 400 miles to South Georgia. A truly heroic story, and it is told in a book entitled Endurance, which is in the media library. There was a lull in Antarctic exploration during World War II, and at the end of the war, interest in airplane flight captured the public's attention. And in 1929, after a successful flight over the North Pole, Richard Byrd established a base called Little America on the Ross Ice Shelf, and then flew over the South Pole. And this started the age of exploration around Antarctica, which continues today. Shortly after 1929, there were 3 major exploratory expeditions. A Norwegian one, which explored the coast of the Weddell Sea and the nearby coast along here, which is called Enderby Land. The British, which explored the east coast here, and the American expedition, which is under now Admiral Byrd, in 1934. He enlarged his base at Little America, and some of his successes were the first successful use of motor vehicles on the continent. He proved that the Earth had been bombarded by meteorites, and probably the most important contribution was the large amount of data concerning the weather, which he collected during a winter he spent alone in a small hut 123 miles inland from his Little America base, and where he almost harbored monoxide poisoning from a faulty stove in his hut. But he persisted in his collection of data, and the story of his winter there is told in his book called Alone. Although the United States has no desire to make territorial claims, New Zealand, Argentina, Germany, Australia, and Chile sent expeditions to establish land claims. However, with the Antarctic Treaty, all these claims are now on hold. After World War II, Admiral Byrd led another expedition in 1947. Over 4,000 men, 13 ships, and 20 airplanes. During this, a large part of the interior was surveyed by both land and air. Over 70,000 aerial photographs were taken. And Byrd now marks the end of heroic figures in Antarctic history. But Byrd also set the path for scientific research, which continues today. Today there are many nations that fund scientific expeditions in different parts of the continent, and they often cooperate. About 2,000 people there in the summer and 800 winter over. Still, individuals will test themselves, striving to reach certain goals. And one example is in 1958, Ed Hillary retraced Scott's path to the pole using tractors and setting up supply depots on the way for Vivian Hughes, who set out with snowcaps from a base on the coast of the Weddell Sea. Hughes reached the pole and then arrived at McMurdo Sound 99 days later, and thus was the first crossing of the continent and the fulfillment of Shackleton's dream. And individuals are still testing themselves. During the holidays, we saw in the newspaper about an Englishman and a Norwegian who were trying to go solo from the coast of the Weddell Sea through the pole and down to McMurdo Sound. The Englishman had to be rescued when he was only 500 miles away. The Norwegian made it by himself, pulling a sledge of supplies to the South Pole. But shortly after the final leg of his journey, he too had to be rescued. And now we'll go to the pictures in Jack's part of the program.
Well, welcome aboard, folks. I kind of thought it would be nice if we had a little snow or appropriate subject to Antarctica, but I couldn't turn the bloody thing off. So, at any rate, we'll proceed now to show you the pictures that we took on this expedition, which they spanned December 1992 to January 1993. Now, this is not our ship. And, however, this is just about the same night as tonight, 10 years ago, near the Ross Sea. This is a British expedition that I caught in the pack ice that Ryan's been telling you about, and went down very promptly. That's a calamity being crushed. The purpose of this is not to show off my extensive museum, but to give you some idea about the importance of packing. Here we were going most of the winter in the southern hemisphere, and these bags, focus a little bit better now. The bag that Marion made, and this is another fabric bag, but using this instead of hard luggage, we could add to your weight. And in this bag, we were able to carry the heavy clothing, the boots, and as well as insect collecting equipment that we would use when we went to the rainforest of Brazil on our way home. It carried all of our photographs, and then the heavy material, like our hiking boots, we would wear. Another feature is this, of course, wearing this coat, the nice padded jacket Ryan made for me that you need in Antarctica. And this is a little knapsack that we could wear when we were exploring the land, and she could take out the lenses I would need, and anything that she needed, I could reach in and take it out of her without using our trip to the southern hemisphere. There's Media, Miami, Buenos Aires, and finally Tierra del Fuego. Tierra del Fuego, of course, this is Buenos Aires, which is another huge metropolis, and we just stayed there overnight. And of course, this is our little topic, the title page for our program tonight. And ahead, but this again is a trip that we made on a small Russian icebreaker that was manufactured in Finland for the Moscow Academy of Science, and after the breakup of the Russian Republic, they were not able to operate it, so a German shipper rented it along with the crew that lived in Leningrad. So we had lawyers and real estate agents and so on waiting on us on the ship. And it's a double-hull icebreaker, an old ship, and a very low draft, so that we could go into some coves and shallow water with relative impunity. It also had all the most modern, sophisticated equipment. You could even see a snowball in the water ahead of you with the material they had there for checking out not only things on the top of the water, but things that were below the water. As far as this is Ushuaia, which is the most southern city in the world. It is in the capital dimension of Tierra del Fuego in Argentina. And looking to the west, you can see the tips of the mountains of the Andes in Chile. And turning around, looking out toward the harbor, you can see our little ship down here in Bolsonaro. Here she is, going east in the Beagle Channel. As you can see, that we're well fitted with all types of sensing devices and lifeboats, which are sealed so that when you get in them, you're in a capsule which has diesel motors and a skipper that goes with it. This was not a gold braid type of trip. This is Valerie Maximoff. This is our captain from Leningrad. And fortunately, with such a small group of people, we had full access to any part of the ship that we wished to go. So we could spend time up in the warm bridge, Marion looking over the bird books to see what's ahead as we're going down towards the peninsula of Antarctica. Here's an artist doing some oil paintings. We had wildlife photographers and naturalists, and as well as people like ourselves from all parts of the world. And we took our own cook, so we had someone who was used to our kind of diet. Now, this is very similar to the map that Karen showed you. This is the Southern Ocean, and this is the prevailing current as it goes around. So I think one thing that's important to realize is the size of things here. This is larger than the United States. This Ross ice shelf is larger than France. So you can understand that when this ice shelf was split off into icebergs, they have icebergs as large as the island of Rhode Island, or the state of Rhode Island. And of course, they get caught up in the current that goes this way through Drake's Passage, and if they don't spin off, they may get, some of them actually circumnavigate a large continent. But this is like a hinged area here. The ice shelves go up and down with the tide, and of course can account for their big icebergs that break off and get into the ocean. Now, this is the peninsula that we're going to explore, and this is Ushuaia here, where we are just coming out of the Beagle Channel to go down along here. Now, as you know, you've probably heard about the roaring 40s, and you've heard how dreadful the wind and the waves are in the Drake Passage. And you can understand this by looking at this map, where you can see that this is like the situation like when you have your garden hose and you want to get an increased velocity. You put your finger over the end and you can squirt the water out with a greater speed. And the same thing happens here at the Drake Passage. You have this mountain range here that you'll see, and you have the Andes coming down here, and everything is pinched in to this passageway, and consequently the rate of speed of both the wind and the water increases when it goes through the narrows. As we leave Ushuaia, we make our way down into the islands and make landings. We were able to anchor in these various bays, as you see here, and then go by, we had 2 rubber rafts that could go in and make landings and explore the entire of the island. This is one of the first places that you will see on this card. Now the question comes up is, how was Antarctica formed? Where did it come from? We have to go back to the so-called plate tectonic that you've been hearing about, and this is Pangaea. This is one huge supercontinent. You're going back 200 million years ago. But as you look here, you will see things that you will recognize. This is the ancient Pacific. This heavy sea is going to become the Mediterranean. This is Eurasia here. This is the United States. These are the people living down far, probably about here now. You can see Africa, what's in our east coast out here off Philadelphia. Here is South America, and this is Africa. There's little Madagascar stuff there, and this is India here. This is going to take the longest trip, incidentally, by going all the way up and attaching to Asia. And it is still active in its trip, producing greater elevation higher. However, down here, you're into Antarctica. And this is Australia. But seeing how close and how well connected these places are, you can understand why you would get fossils of beech trees like you find the living form in South America, in Antarctica. You find bones of marsupials in Antarctica. And you'll also, you will see even some of the dinosaurs that are in Africa, and plants and so on, you'll find common to Antarctica. How did this happen? It's shown here by examples of the tectonic plates that are separated. This represents molten material called the salt that's coming up from the asthenosphere, the center of your Earth, which is very hot, and as it splits into the land here, it will cause it to break apart. As you see here, this is the basalt lava, and the continental plates then will be moved apart. So you notice the pink here, we'll duplicate it in the next picture, where you can see that the rifts have increased, and these continents now are drifting apart. And this will take place over some 20 million years, to where they are going to be separated for pretty much what you know of today. That's 180 million years ago. But here's the Pacific Sea again. Here's going to be Italy and the Mediterranean. North America before it connected to South America. And here is India getting stripped up to where it is. Here's Antarctica still here, but these things, these plates are being separated, and consequently, this is a dinosaur that lived in the Beardmore Glacier area that I was talking about, and there are bones that are common to this in Africa. So there were dinosaurs that lived in Antarctica. And for your interest, brought along what is referred to as a sauropod. This is a sauropod egg that was collected in Western China about this time last year. This one exhibit up here, not necessarily the Listersaurus. And take a little footnote in that it's mounted up here in a special case. Most of my patients were all good friends, and very special people, but we have some that passed away that I'd like to have a little memorial, and that will explain some of the later. This is one of our first landings into a Polish base in the peninsula. This is what their living quarters here. They're quite warm. They have all the modern conveniences. These, of course, are whale bones that are collected out here, and they were doing studies on the penguins. This is known as the Arctic base, and it was after Christmas time. So that these fellows are getting ready to go back to Poland. I took a picture inside so you get some idea of how some things are, or how they can be made in Antarctica. You can see their Christmas tree back here. So they're getting ready to pack to go back home. As we go down parallel to the peninsula, this was Deception Island, which you'll see in the back. This is Bailey's Head, which is a basalt extruding from the earth, and looking from the point where I took that picture toward the shore, you can see all these heads. There are no natives to Antarctica, but there are over 100 million penguins that live. So all these little heads here are the heads of penguins looking at you. This is a 10 square mile caldera of a volcano that is on Deception Island. Back in 1924, the British used this as a whaling station, and they had factory ships in their little protected bay over here when the volcano started to become active, and the hot waters that came up from the bay started to burn the paint off the bottom of the ship, and they had to make a quick exodus, leaving a lot of their buildings and their ships behind, and they haven't been able to use it for it since. This is still an active volcano, but smoldering along. In 1970, it had an eruption. Here again, you can see the Bailey's Head of this dissolving column, as well as the penguins. You see great numbers that are sitting in their rookeries up on the hilltop. This is called Neptune's Bellows. Here's the peninsula shooting up here, and we're going in between these passages. This is the place, as you can judge here, real cold wind came along. What I'm going to show you now are a series of pictures that I took at midnight from the bridge of the ship, just to give you an idea what it's like at this time of the year as you sit here at midnight. One thing about traveling to an Arctic or a Antarctic part of the world, if you go there in their summertime, you get your money worth in 24 hours of daylight, and just looking out from the bridge of the ship. You have to take a lot of film with you because it's so photogenic that every picture looks better than the last one you took. One professional photographer with us, who worked for Hallmark, he had 2 trash bags full of those films. To give you an idea how many pictures. Every few minutes you'll see changing in the cloud formation. And here is part of the Nancy on the peninsula that I described. But it's quite awe-inspiring as you cruise down along the peninsula at midnight to see the beautiful light. That was an iceberg that just went by. Now, up here on the podium, and you're most welcome to look at these things, give you some idea of icebergs are formed and what the danger is. Their greatest danger, of course, is under the water, which is 60 to 90%. And this little sketch will give you some idea of that. But here's some of the extrusions of the basalts that form volcanic material that is formed. As you can see, it's an impressive mass of ice, and some of these take little trips in the rubber boat into some of the little coves, Paradise Bay, and these are icebergs, and small icebergs, avalanches that are falling off the glaciers that are protruding along the shoreline. This is the crab-eater seal. We'll get a better picture of that. So these are going to work their way out into the main current in the Southern Ocean. So this is the crab-eater seal, the true seal. It can go down around 2,000 feet and stay there for over half an hour. And his favorite diet are the famous krill, which you have heard about. These are the krill. Found these along the shoreline that were to die off. And I think that they may be krill that was killed at the time that the Russian and Japanese seine ships were harvesting the krill. They go through the great masses of them, and they're taking more than their quota, which is over 500,000 tons of krill per year. But anyway, this is the beginning of the food chain for everything that goes all the way up into the huge whale. See, they're well invested with the carotene, gives them this orange color. Whether they ever have any trouble with cancer or not, but at any rate, this is one way that you can find what the penguins are eating, because they're dropping. They're also quite orange if they're feeding. These little animals have stain-like mouth parts, and they will feed under this pack ice Marion was telling you about. This acts almost like a solar panel. Sunlight can go through, and on the underside, the microscopic animals, there's some under the microscope up here, so-called phytoplankton, are able to make use of the sunlight and the phosphates and the salt and the nutrients that are in the water to manufacture things like diatoplankton, which are all these one-celled animals. These one-celled animals are capable, it's like from the end of, the beginning of October until now, proliferate in a remarkable way. Every 4 hours, these one-celled animals will split and form two. And just think what the United States will look like, people do the same thing. And, but you also want to think how large this pack ice is. It's just like if you took the United States as one big mass of ice, and underneath it you had these solar panels with the plankton growing, these little animals feeding on it. That represents an enormous source of food, and it's the beginning of food that goes all the way up, and actually, here's again is another one of the crab-eating seals. Of course, his major diet is the krill, and he has a special set of teeth for staining out the krill in his teeth. Sketch up here of this unusual tooth structure that you can see, and there's a little of the krill that you just saw the picture of up here. Being on a Russian ship, I didn't have anything to block it to preserve them in, but at any rate, that's what they're in right now, and I kind of wash them out a little bit. So here is an avalanche in progress, and if you're around here in your Zodiac or rubber boat, you don't want to get with that. Now, if you find exposures of rock, this is a Gen 2 penguin taking the days of this. They stack up little piles of rocks, pebbles here, to settle down for their nest. This is the nesting season. There's one there looking out over the real estate over the ocean. The many seabirds will have a red area. You see your herring gull will have it and so on, which is a little target area for the chip to tap on to stimulate regurgitation of the food that's in his mother's craw. After this is done, she will open her mouth and he'll stick his head right down in her esophagus and get a good gulp of macerated krill. Now, these penguins here are coming from a plateau that we went up to, but at the time of nesting, the male bird will spend 2 weeks on the nest, while his wife goes down for a bath and spends time feeding up and becoming fat on krill. And of course, when her time is up and has changed the guard, this has all been carved out by, this looks like it did here last week. But the group is going back, you see, to replace the ones that are up on the hill. Then after about 3 or 4 weeks, the two of them will take turns to keep these little they're immaculate, like they're tuxedos, they just come back from the cleaner. As you look along the bottom, you will find some familiar, these are selenite. This is a sea urchin, and this is an iodine-rich kelp, as you see here, the seaweed. And over here is a liquid. This is the fleshy part that sucks onto the rock. This is what it looks like here when it is placed normally on the rock. And this is a sponge, which is very high in sulfur. This is a starfish that you'll find in the bottom in Antarctica. It's missing a ray, which is gradually being regenerated. This is far less common than the krill. This is a gametopod, or it has 10 feet. Decapod is what it's called, and you'll find it under the rock very much like you find crayfish around here. Now here, supposing you were a krill or one of those decapods, came up underneath the pack ice, this is what you would see, the greenery of the plankton that is able to photosynthesize. They have chlorophyll in them. And as I say, you take a look at these beautiful little creatures that are doing this under the microscope up here on the left. And this is what they feed on. And this vast area, with the equivalent of the United States, is like this on the underside during October, November, December, and even up to now. And this is what they feed on. And of course, the other animals that feed on that. You also will get fungi that will color some of the ice a pink color. Now look how nice and plump feet is after feeding up on the krill. This is a Gen 2 penguin that is incubating her egg. This is one of those wildlife photographers waiting for the right moment to take a picture in Antarctica. This is our little ship out here in the Sound, and it's a place we were when those penguins were coming down or from here. The one penguin that we will see soon will make great trips into the center part of Antarctica. These are the cormorants. They're both taking a nap by putting their head under their wing. Here's a Gen 2 that really needs to be cleaned up. You see the orange of the bed of carrots and you've got it back. This will give you an idea how big a whale it is compared to Marion. This is a Fort Lockerbie. This was an abandoned British whaling station along with the first. We would wear our loud clothing, of course, this hat, which Marion could always find me, but we stuck together because we needed to in order to get our photographic equipment out of our knapsack. This is the Fort Lockerbie station, and what you find when you go to Arctic and Antarctic areas is that these places may be many years old, but it's so bloody cold there that things don't deteriorate. And you can walk around and go into these buildings and look at just like yesterday. Look at the signs of the glaciers. Now this is a crew of Gen 2s that are just coming out and going to do replacement duty on the net. Now in here I found a little patch of moss, and I sorted through it and was able to find the only three arthropods that are found in the South Polar area. So looking in here, the first thing was the springtail. Now these will live in this part of the world, and they're so called because in this part they have a little spring that they're able to set. And you will see them in the wintertime. You walk through the snow, and when you come back over your footprints, they'll look all black from what looks like pepper. Put it in your trash. If you put your hand down, next thing you know, they all disappear. They have this mouse pack type of spring, and they will zip right out of the compression where your foot was. And I guess if you measure them out, they could jump over your two-story home. This is a wingless fly that is in among the moss also. You'll find where places are having terrible weather and high winds, that many of your winged insects will lose their wings. This is the ubiquitous mite, and he's under the microscope at that end of the table. not this species, but that kind of thing, and died. These are the cormorants. This is the thing that that made this trip very good is we weren't rushed, and we were able to make frequent landings and spend quite a bit of time, and sit down among these birds and watch their interaction. Here you can see some courting going along. They're preening one another. These are the cormorants, which are primary fish-eating birds. And of course they have an audience of 2 penguins looking on. This is the pair of the cormorants with their big fuzzy babies here. This one's taking a nap and he's keeping a look at. Here's a good profile of the cormorant, and you can see the pieces of seaweed and stuff that he's debris from the bottom to build this up to give him a protected column on which to raise his young. Here's another little gentoo chick getting ready. You can see how red it is inside of the roof of the mouth is here. It stimulates to get his deal. Now this is a different penguin. There's one up here on the right called an Adelie penguin. They usually have kind of the white hybrids. And as an example too, that we were watching these things, these birds seem to have a sense of humor and a sense of play. One thing they love to do is to go sledding. See that he's not only well, but he's well padded with his feathers, and he's going on a sledding trip, as you see here, coming down the hill. And of course, when you get to the bottom of the hill, you have to contemplate walking all the way back up again. But they're patient birds. This particular type of penguin may have its nesting site as much as from here to Lancaster, from the ocean. So he has to walk from here to Lancaster in the equivalent distance in order to take care of his nest. There's some that actually have been found over 200 miles inland. These are your Adelies, and this was a little bit of drama here. He's been up here with this bloke here with a dirty shirt, and he just came up from the ocean and he's all cleaned up. And their way of communicating is by their call. One of the folks that called the other night I hadn't spoken to for quite some time on the telephone was wanting to know if we would make it tonight. And I said yes, and I said, "You don't know who I am?" "Oh, sure, I know who you are." I said, "I can tell you among 500,000 penguins, because they can voice recognize. They may be a quarter mile down the ocean, and they will call, and the one that isn't taking the duty on the nest will stand up, and you'll hear them call back. And that way, by calling and calling, they come up." But he made his way up, but you can see he's really not pleased with the confidence he's been keeping, and from the tent, so they tell him where to go. Here's a Adelie taking a nap, and you can see these, there's some feathers, tail feathers of the penguin up here, but this is almost like their third leg on this tripod. They let them stand in this erect position. They're very stiff. And one thing that's interesting too, as you watch these birds, they're great at penny thievery. They'll go along and they'll steal the other pebbles while he's asleep. And every now and then they'll get somebody who wasn't totally asleep, and they'll peck at one another. This is our Southern Quest, the ship that sank in 1986 by the pack ice. You all ready? Okay, here we go. I don't think your carousel's in place for it. There you go. You see, somebody tried to steal his pebbles, and look what he got. He got a tail feather. There's the little chicks down here, but they start to look like a butterball, and they're well insulated. And these are birds can take this horrendous weather that Baron was explaining to you. Antarctica is certainly no place to go skinny because it's 28.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you go in your underwear, you only last for 30 seconds. And if you put all the clothes on you saw you had it fall overboard, you only last for 60 seconds. And you have to go prepared. Be very careful not to fall in. But look how long this tail is when it's in her support. As we went into one of the coves, I could see outcropping. It must be a massive crop. The horrendous weather down here, I think, is one of the deterrents for any kind of mining, at least in our time. But this is an azurite color here, and there's green up in here, malachite. They're both hydrated copper carbonate that are leaching out of this whole cliff side. and must represent quite a large deposit. You'll find some of the pebbles that somebody brought back from Antarctica are up here on the table. You'll actually see here these huge glaciers that are starting to split and tab, and you don't want to get too close in your little boat, because you never know when that thing can fall. These are glaciers that go in to the peninsula, and you're looking at some of the rock formations that Marion described to you that are rather recent origin in Antarctica. So as you go along in the haze, and you look up, you may find that you're this right below an enormous iceberg. Of course, you wouldn't go this close to the ship because a good bit of the iceberg is underneath the ocean. The thing is that the ice will serve to filter out your ultraviolet. If you look in here, you can see how blue and violet colored it is. I've gone into ice caves in places like the top of Mount Rainier, and if you've had your clothing washed with detergents, they will fluoresce bright colors that are on your clothing. It's just like you find the lights of Times Square, you just seem to light up. If you went up into these little caves, the same thing you do. Even on overcast day, considerable ultraviolet will come through. Now this represents an abandoned station in Chile, and unfortunately many of these Antarctic stations were not cleaned up. And you can see that these are some of the old timbers from that station. Then there are two little birds that are scavengers in Antarctica. They're called sheathbills. They're about the size of a chicken and look a lot like a chicken, but they're not a chicken. And they have a perfectly clear sheath protection around their bill, and I think they really need it because they live on the carrion and sort through the droppings of the seals and the penguins for bits of undigested krill and anything else that was eaten. But they had a little nest right here underneath this timber. These have been here for a great many years. Now, these birds, this is the other penguin that is common in Antarctica called the chin strap. And there's a specimen up here for you to get a closer look. And here she has two chicks. And this happened to be a hot day in Antarctica. It was around 40 degrees. And with all that clothing on, you can see that the birds painted. Now, this is the only ship we saw other than our own during our trip. This is one of those love boats. And of course they had to stop here because they didn't have the shallow draft as we did. But they have several hundred people that are pretty well encased in glass so that they aren't subject to the rigors of South Polar voyages. Another thing that one sees is that these penguins will frequently climb up on board an iceberg to voyage out to the Southern Ocean. And it looks like they're just taking off in Florida where they get a certain distance from their nest, go back in the ocean, and then will swim back where their nest is, feeding on them while they go. Here's the loner here going out on the Southern Ocean and heading out towards the Great Pass. And of course, as you go by, you'll see all kinds of shapes that you imagine like this is like one of the Egyptian sphinxes. Another thing that's interesting as you sit down and watch these birds, when it's time to go in, you see here in a deli waiting for the gentoo to go in and vice versa. What you see cruising along the coastline here is the leopard seal. He usually just comes up for a little air and then he bubbles down and keeps close to the shoreline waiting for one of these birds to go in. So he says, you go ahead, no after you. These seals are voracious. They have a dentition like a bear with big canine teeth. And they come up under these penguins and they can grab them, and by shaking their head, they can actually skin the whole penguin. You'll see the skin of the penguins floating out on the ocean, and they swallow them whole. They have found in autopsy leopard seals 27 skinned penguins in their gut. Here's another Argentinian deserted station. There was a physician that was manning this, and I think that the solitary situation got to him, and he went off his rocker and burnt most of the place down. These are the only buildings that are still left, but that's inactive now. Here's a little portrait of one of these crab-eating seals that can go down such great depth, and despite the pressure they're under, they don't suffer any ill effects. We went over that when we went into the Steelers, Georgia. Here's another one of your chin straps. She has two nice chicks right here. And of course, he doesn't have the red beak like the Delhi, but it's so packed. In a similar way, to stimulate regurgitation of the krill. There's a little part. There was another one of those warm days, and he was a little bit of pain. There again is another one with a little baby and a hot day. When he gets to 40 there, and these in their own clothes, it's too warm. Here you see again these big feathers that act as a good support for this chin strap. Now he's really hot up there. And there's a little chick. Like this, that might even be in there. Now I was contemplating bringing this vertebral body home and this rib, and I had a past inspection with these three chin tubes, and they said, well, you can get them in your duffel bag, you can have them. Well, I say, you can't get them in any duffel bag. But you see the likes of them up here on the table. But this particular spot was manned by a group of university students under the guidance of their professor, and they were studying some of the habits of the gentoo penguins. Here you see their little encampment, and at the time we were there, they were taking the buildings down, and when they leave, you won't see any oil drums, you won't see any vestiges of their having been there, and they were getting ready to do that packing at the time. Now supposing you were in this space capsule and you were looking down on the globe from the south, you were looking through the ozone hole, and here it is. By the way, there are some astronomers in the audience. If you want to see Jupiter 24 hours a day, you go to Antarctica because it's never set. And there's some recent information that came out today on what they found about Antarctica. But here is Antarctica. This is the peninsula where we are, and this is Tierra del Fuego. See the giraffe? There's Australia over there. This is what it was in partisan section. Now, just because of the problem with time, I made a diagram to try to explain the concept of what is destroying the ozone that protects us from ultraviolet, especially ultraviolet B, which is the one considered to be the most carcinogenic. It also damages your DNA, and it triggers your immune system, so it has a powerful effect on it. It's also the band of radiation that stimulates the activity of the retrovirus, which I think everybody in this room has had and will harbor indefinitely. It's the fever blister. And when you go out into the sun, this little virus is residing in your lips. The exposure is all it needs to resurface into a cold sore. And then it goes back and waits for the next exposure. Now this is the source of the chlorofluorocarbons, like the spray paint, old refrigerators, go up into the high altitude, 15 miles up here, where the ultraviolet will split off the chlorine in the chlorofluorocarbons, and this chemical reaction here, it will recycle so that the chlorine will not only split the extra oxygen off, the ozone, which is made by the ultraviolet coming down from the sun. The electromagnetic energy that's from the sun is what makes the ozone up here, converting oxygen into ozone or O3, which has a very fragile connection with the molecule, and it splits off so that the chlorine can be recycled and comes back up and does the same thing over again. So one chlorine can destroy millions of ozone. There are other things too that may contribute to it. It's open, for instance, when Mount Erebus is one of the highest volcanoes in Antarctica. When it's erupting, it'll get rid of 1,000 hydrochloric acid a day. So it's of interest too for a volcano is that it erupts a very fine crystalline gold. It'll fly over here, collect it, and use the measurements of it to get some idea of the activity of the volcano. So again, I made these as handouts. There's some in the back, there's some up here. This is the pro side of the ozone, which is continuing, and many believe as a cause of the increased rate of skin. You're welcome to take those home and study them. And on the other side is some of the arguments against this concept. But it is, of course, seeing in the skin, and I'm sure many here have had this experience already from exposures that we had when we were younger. It's estimated that more than 500,000 cases are diagnosed in this country each year. Places like Punta Arenas in Chile, when we were there had a rate before the carbon discussion, and now it's 26% incidence of skin cancer, and even the sheep, they believe, are getting cataracts from the exposure to the ultraviolet rays. And about 1 in 7 people in our audience would be affected. And of course, the 3 commonest types of tumors that are provoked by it's believed to be your basal cell, which is one type of cancer that is very easy to excise and cure. Same way with this, if you're careful to get proper attention when you first have type. This, of course, but if it becomes malignant melanoma, it's a very aggressive type of malignancy. This is what your skin may look like, when you go out for the first time in the spring without any the wide brim hat or sunscreen, and you'll get a little sunburn. In other places, it's very vulnerable at the top of your ear, so it's good to wear a light hat. This is something I would say we can find in everyone that's in the audience. These are just little benign dyslexic nevi or freckles, and usually they're things you're born with, and you'll carry them away for another. However, this is the basal cell type of tumor, which is kind of curly and firm, and it's usually on the exposed areas of your face, and they can be easily excised or treated by competent dermatologists with minimal amount of scarring and very little risk. This is the squamous cell type of tumor, which may have more of a tendency to spread out from the center point, and may itch a little bit as well. But this is the one that's of greatest concern, the melanoma. You can see it has the irregular outlines to these pigmented lesions, and they also become a more deep purple color in the center. That is the malignant type. And here's a single one. But notice it's also usually larger than a half a centimeter and has this irregular outline.